July 1944. The skies over the Third Reich. American bomber crews and fighter pilots began to report a phenomenon that defied physics. They saw aircraft that had no propellers. These strange machines moved at speeds that made the P-51 Mustang look like it was standing still. They would streak through the bomber formations, fire a barrage of 30mm cannon shells, and vanish before the turret gunners could even traverse their guns. This was the Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, Swallow. It was the world's first operational jet fighter. To the Allied airmen, it was a shock. For years, they had been told that they possessed technological superiority. They had the best engines, the best fuel, the best sights. But suddenly, the Germans had leaped a generation ahead. Intelligence reports were frantic. The enemy has a plane that can fly 540 miles per hour. General Spaatz and General Doolittle were worried. If the Germans could produce these jets in large numbers, the air superiority the Allies had fought so hard to win could evaporate. A Mustang diving at full throttle could barely catch an Me-262 in level flight. The psychological impact was immense. The Allied pilots felt obsolete. They felt like knights in armor facing a gunman. Rumors spread through the mess halls. The Jerry jets run on kerosene. They don't have engines, they have rockets. The Allied High Command needed an answer. They needed to prove to their own men that the Germans didn't possess magic. They needed to show that the Allies had jets too. And they did. Hidden away in the secret hangars of the Royal Air Force was a machine that had been in development just as long as the German jet. It wasn't as sleek. It wasn't as fast. But it was ready. The whine of the German jet was about to be answered by the roar of the British Meteor. The story of the Allied jet age begins not with a corporation, but with a single, stubborn man, Frank Whittle. A genial, brilliant RAF officer, Whittle had patented the design for a turbojet engine as early as 1930. But for years, the British Air Ministry ignored him. They thought the idea of a gas turbine engine for an aircraft was fantasy. The materials to withstand the heat didn't exist, they said. Whittle didn't give up. He formed a small company called Power Jets Limited. Working in a derelict foundry in Lutterworth, with almost no funding, he built the W. Whittle unit. It was a terrifying contraption. When he first ran it in 1937, it spun out of control. The engine screamed like a banshee, glowing red-hot, threatening to explode and kill everyone in the room. Whittle stayed at the controls, wrestling the fuel valves, until he tamed the beast. While the Germans were pouring millions of Reichsmarks into their jet program, led by Hans von Ohain, Whittle was working on a shoestring budget. But he had one advantage. His design, the centrifugal flow engine, was robust. The German engine design, axial flow, was more aerodynamic but incredibly fragile and complex. Whittle's engine was essentially a modified supercharger. It was tough. By 1941, the Gloster Aircraft Company had built a test airframe, the E.2839. When it flew, the test pilot famously said, "It was just like a normal plane, only it made a noise like a giant vacuum cleaner." The British government finally woke up. They realized they were sitting on the future of aviation. They ordered Gloster to build a combat fighter around Whittle's engines. The project was top secret. It was code-named Rampage. While the Me-262 was grabbing the headlines with its shark-like looks, the British were quietly building a machine that prioritized reliability over raw speed. Whittle's workshop had produced the heartbeat of a new era. The result of Whittle's genius and Gloster's airframe design was the Meteor. When it rolled out of the hangar, it didn't look like a spaceship, unlike the Me-262, which looked alien with its swept wings. The Meteor MKI looked sensible. It had straight wings. It had a traditional tail. It looked like a standard heavy fighter, except for one thing: where the propellers should be, there were just holes. The two engines, Rolls-Royce Wellens, based on Whittle's design, were embedded in the wings. This conservative design was intentional. The British engineers knew that jet engines were new and risky. They didn't want to complicate things with a radical airframe. They wanted a stable gun platform. The Meteor was armed with 20mm Hispano cannons in the nose. A devastating punch. It had a tricycle landing gear to keep the jet exhaust from burning the runway, a lesson learned early. To the pilots of 616 Squadron, the first unit to receive the jets, the Meteor was a revelation. It was smooth. Piston engines vibrate. They shake the airframe. They roar. The jet engine hummed. The flight was vibration-free. It felt like gliding. But it was also heavy. The early Meteors were underpowered. Their top speed was around 415 miles per hour, faster than a Spitfire, but slower than the Me-262, which could hit 540 miles per hour. However, the Meteor had an ace up its sleeve. Reliability. The Me-262's engines had a lifespan of 10 to 25 hours before they needed a complete overhaul. They were prone to catching fire if the pilot moved the throttle too fast. The Meteor's engines were rated for 150 hours. The pilot could slam the throttle open and closed without exploding. The Germans had built a race car engine. The British had built a truck engine. And in a war of attrition, trucks win. The introduction of the Meteor to the RAF bases was a comedy of confusion. Pilots taxiing their Spitfires and Typhoons would stop and stare. They saw a plane moving along the taxiway with no propeller turning. "How is it moving?" they asked. The noise was different. A high-pitched whine that turned into a deep rumble as the plane passed. The heat coming out of the back was intense. Ground crews learned quickly not to walk behind a Meteor when the engines were running, or they would be blown over and singed. Pilots nicknamed them squirts or meat boxes. Flying the Meteor required a new set of skills. There was no torque-on takeoff. In a propeller plane, the engine tries to twist the plane sideways. The Meteor tracked straight and true. But the acceleration was slow. Jet engines need speed to breathe. On the takeoff roll, the Meteor felt sluggish. Once it got up to speed, however, it came alive. The cockpit was quiet. The visibility over the nose was perfect, no engine block in the way. But the most dangerous aspect for the new jet pilots wasn't the enemy, it was their own friends. The profile of the Meteor was dangerously similar to the Me-262. Both were twin-engine jets without propellers. Allied anti-aircraft gunners and Mustang pilots were itchy-fingered. They saw a jet, they shot at it. To prevent friendly fire, the RAF issued strict orders. The Meteors were strictly forbidden from flying over Allied-held territory in France initially. They were kept in England. Their first mission wasn't to fight the Luftwaffe. It was to fight robots. The V-1 flying bombs, the Doodlebugs, were raining down on London. They were fast. The Spitfires were struggling to catch them. The RAF looked at the Meteor. It was fast at low altitude. It had 4 cannons. Send up the squirts, the command came down. The jet age wasn't going to start with a dogfight. It was going to start with a robot hunt. Summer 1944. The Second Blitz. Hitler unleashed his V-1 flying bombs against London. These were the first cruise missiles. Pulse jet-powered robots that flew at 400 miles per hour at 2,000 feet. They were too fast for the anti-aircraft guns to track effectively until the proximity fuse arrived. They were too fast for most piston fighters. Spitfire pilots had to dive their engines to the breaking point just to get within range. But the Gloster Meteor was built for this. The jets of 616 Squadron were assigned to diver patrols. It was a strange kind of combat. Man against machine. The Meteor pilot would spot the V-1 by the distinct pulsing flame of its exhaust. He would push the throttles forward. The Rolls-Royce Welland engines would scream. The Meteor would accelerate to 415 miles per hour. Unlike the piston fighters, the Meteor didn't vibrate or shake at this speed. It was a stable platform. The pilot would close the distance. He had to be careful. The V-1 was a flying bomb loaded with 1,800 pounds of amatol. If he shot it from too close, less than 200 yards, the explosion would destroy his own plane. If he shot it from too far, he might miss. The Meteor pilots learned to fly into the danger zone, fire a short burst from there for 20mm cannons, and break away violently. The first V-1 kill by a jet fighter occurred on August 4, 1944. Flying Officer Dean destroyed a Doodlebug over Tunbridge Wells. It was a historic moment. The jet age had drawn its first blood. But it wasn't just about shooting. The cannons on the early Meteors were prone to jamming. The belt feed mechanism struggled with the G-forces. Pilots often found themselves behind a V-1, perfectly positioned, only to pull the trigger and hear silence. This led to the development of one of the most audacious tactics in the history of aerial warfare. When the guns failed, the pilots used physics. The V-1 was a crude machine. It was kept level by a simple gyroscopic autopilot. It relied on the airflow over its wings remaining stable. The Meteor pilots realized they could use their own aircraft as a weapon. The tactic was called tipping. The pilot would fly his Meteor alongside the V-1. He would match its speed exactly, 400 miles per hour. He would inch closer. Wingtip to wingtip. Steel to steel. The buffer of air between the two wings would compress. Then, with a gentle flick of the control stick, the Meteor pilot would bank away. The airflow over his wing would disrupt the air under the V-1's wing. The V-1 would roll over. The primitive gyroscope would tumble. The guidance system would fail. The pulse jet would often stall from the sudden attitude change. The bomb would spiral harmlessly into the English countryside, miles short of London. It required nerves of steel. Flying formation with a robot bomb at 400 miles per hour is dangerous enough. Physically touching it with your wingtip is suicidal. But the Meteor pilots did it. They proved that the jet fighter wasn't just a gun platform. It was a physical force in the sky. The German engineers who designed the V-1 never anticipated this. They thought speed was the ultimate defense. They didn't count on a British pilot having the audacity to play bumper cars at 2,000 feet. This maneuver became the signature move of the Meteor. It showed that the human element was still decisive, even in a battle of high-tech machines. As the V-1 threat subsided, the RAF wanted to send the Meteors to France to fight the Luftwaffe. But they had a problem. From a distance, the Gloster Meteor looked suspiciously like the Messerschmitt Me 262. Both had two engines. Both lacked propellers. Both were fast. The Allied anti-aircraft gunners on the ground were trigger-happy. They had been briefed to shoot at any jet because jets were German. Mustang and Thunderbolt pilots, roaming the skies over Europe, were also looking for jets to kill. The fear of friendly fire was so high that the RAF initially banned the Meteor from crossing the Channel. When they finally deployed to Belgium in 1945, they had to take drastic measures. The Meteors were painted entirely white. Or, later, they were given high-visibility markings that were impossible to miss. It was a humiliating necessity. Here was the most advanced fighter in the Allied arsenal, and it had to be painted like a surrender flag just to survive its own friends. This paint job had a tactical cost. It made the Meteors visible for miles. They couldn't use camouflage to hide on the ground or in the air. But it was better than being shot down by a standard U.S. Army Quad 50 mount. The German Me 262s, by contrast, were painted in dark greens and browns to hide in the forests. The white Meteors patrolled the skies of Belgium like ghosts. They were a symbol of the confusion of the new era. The technology had advanced faster than the recognition manuals. Soldiers on the ground simply couldn't process the idea of an Allied jet. To them, the sound of a jet engine meant enemy. The Meteor crews had to fight a war on two fronts, against the Germans, and against the nervous reflexes of their own side. The comparison between the Gloster Meteor and the Messerschmitt Me 262 is often reduced to speed. Yes, the Me 262 was faster, 540 miles per hour vs 415 miles per hour for the Meteor I, though the Meteor III closed the gap. But speed is useless if the engine melts. The German Jumo 00 for engine was a marvel of theoretical engineering, but a disaster of manufacturing. It used an axial flow design, compressor blades arranged in a line. This was aerodynamic and efficient. But Germany lacked high-temperature alloys like nickel and chromium. They had to use inferior steel. The Jumo engines had a service life of 10 to 25 hours. After that, they had to be scrapped. If a German pilot advanced the throttle too quickly, the engine would flame out or catch fire. They had to nurse the throttle. The British Rolls-Royce Welland, and later Derwent, engines used a centrifugal flow design. They worked like a turbocharger. A big fan slinging air outwards. It was wider and created more drag, hence the Meteor's thick engine nacelles. But it was robust. The turbine blades were made of pneumonic alloy, a nickel-based superalloy developed by British scientists specifically for this purpose. The Welland engine was rated for 150 hours between overhauls. A Meteor pilot could slam the throttle from idle to full power in seconds without fear. This reliability was a tactical weapon. The Germans spent half their time changing engines. The British spent their time flying. The Meteor could fly sortie after sortie, day after day. It proved that in the long run, the tortoise engineering, simple, reliable, beats the hare engineering, fast, fragile. The Me 262 was a racehorse with a heart condition. The Meteor was a draft horse that could run forever. And in 1945, with the German logistics collapsing, reliability was the only performance metric that mattered. In January 1945, the Meteors finally crossed the Channel. 616 Squadron moved to Melsbroek, near Brussels. This was historic. The Allies had deployed jet fighters to the front line. But the pilots were frustrated. The RAF High Command was still terrified of losing a Meteor to the Germans. They didn't want the secret of the engines falling into enemy hands. So, they issued strict rules of engagement. The Meteors were forbidden from crossing the front line into German-held territory. They were restricted to defensive patrols behind Allied lines. The pilots, eager to test their machines against the Luftwaffe, chafed under these restrictions. They flew armed recce missions, patrolling the skies over Belgium and Holland, looking for German intruders. But the Luftwaffe was already dying. German sorties were rare. The Meteor pilots spent hours patrolling empty skies, burning fuel, waiting for a fight that never came. They knew the Me 262s were out there. They could see the contrails in the distance, over Germany. But they couldn't pursue. It was a strange, anticlimactic introduction to combat. The most advanced fighter in the world was being used as a border guard. However, the psychological impact was significant. The Allied ground troops saw the jets. They heard the distinctive roar. It boosted morale. It told the soldiers on the ground that their side had the wonder weapons too. And for the Germans, it was a warning. German reconnaissance planes spotted the jets on the ground at Melsbroek. The reports went back to Berlin. The British have jets in Belgium. The monopoly was over. The Me 262 was no longer the only game in town. As the Allied armies pushed into Germany, the restrictions were slowly lifted. In April 1945, the Meteors were finally allowed to cross the line. But by then, there were no German fighters in the air to fight. So, the Meteors went down to the deck. They became ground attack aircraft. The pilots used their speed to strafe German airfields, transport columns, and trains. The stability of the Meteor made it an excellent gun platform. The 20mm cannons tore through parked German aircraft. In one famous incident, a flight of Meteors caught a formation of Fieseler Storch liaison planes on the ground. They destroyed them in a single pass. But ground attack in a jet was dangerous. The early jet engines were vulnerable to foreign object damage, FOD. Debris from explosions could be sucked into the intakes, destroying the compressor blades. And at 400 miles per hour on the deck, things happen fast. The pilots had to learn to think ahead of the plane. In one tragic accident, a Meteor pilot flew through the explosion of a German ammunition truck he had just strafed. The debris brought him down. Despite the risks, the Meteors proved effective. They destroyed 46 German aircraft on the ground. It wasn't the glorious air-to-air combat they had dreamed of, but it was effective. They were using the technology of the future to destroy the remnants of the past. The German flak gunners, tracking the fast-moving jets, found them hard to hit. The Meteor didn't have the telltale propeller noise. It arrived silently, sound lags behind at high speed, and was gone before they could traverse their guns. That whittle whine became the sound of the final collapse of the Luftwaffe. Did the Meteor ever fight the Me-262? It is the great unanswered question of World War II aviation. Officially, there is no record of a jet-on-jet dogfight. But there were close calls. On several occasions, Meteor pilots reported seeing Me-262s in the distance. They turned to engage. They pushed their throttles to the stops. But the circumstances conspired against them. Sometimes, the German jets were too far away. Sometimes, the Meteors were low on fuel. And sometimes, ground control intervened. Blue section, return to base. Do not pursue. The RAF commanders were terrified of a Meteor being shot down inside Germany. They prioritized security over glory. The German pilots, too, were wary. They had strict orders to avoid combat unless they had a clear advantage. They were saving their strength for the bombers. So, the two great rivals of the era circled each other like boxers in different rings. They never touched gloves. It remains one of the great what-ifs of history. Who would have won? The Me-262 was faster and had heavier guns, 30 mm. The Meteor was more maneuverable, had better engines, and better visibility. Most modern analysts believe the Me-262 had the edge in a high-speed slash attack, but the Meteor would have won a turning dogfight. But we will never know. The forbidden dogfight never happened. Instead, the two jets passed each other in the night, ships of a new age sailing on different tides. When the war ended on May 8, 1945, the Gloster Meteor was the only Allied jet to have seen combat. It hadn't won the war single-handedly. It hadn't swept the skies like the Mustang. But it had proved a point. It proved that the Allies were not technologically backward. It proved that the gas turbine engine was viable, reliable, and ready for mass production. The German jet program, for all its brilliance, was a dead end. It was built on slave labor, scarce materials, and desperation. It collapsed with the RAF. The British jet program was built on sound engineering and industrial capability. The Meteor didn't stop in 1945. It evolved. The Meteor F.4 and F.8 became the backbone of the RAF and many other air forces for the next decade. It broke the world airspeed record, 606 miles per hour, in 1945 and again in 1946. It fought in the Korean War, though by then it was outclassed by the MiG-15. It was the father of the modern jet fighter. Frank Whittle, the man who was ignored in the 1930s, was finally knighted. His invention had changed the world. The roar of the Meteor's engines in 1944 was the sound of the future arriving. The propeller age was over. The jet age had begun. And while the Germans had started the race, the British, with their sturdy, reliable, boring Meteor, had crossed the finish line first.